Welcome to On the Ballot, a Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for being with us. So before we get started with today's show, just a quick special request for our listeners as we end the year and start thinking about 2025, what we're thankful for, and what we want to do with the show. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you like about the show. Tell us what you don't like. Tell us what you'd like to see. Of course, how are you going to tell us? We're not a call-in radio show. You've got to email us. You've got to tweet at us. You got to send us a message somewhere that gets to Frank, our podcast producer, so he can hear it and digest it and figure out what we can do with that information. We really want to hear from you, so you can email us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on X at Ballotpedia or in the comment box or whatever is easiest for you. I promise it'll find its way to our team. Thanks for your help. Let's get to the episode now. Political recounts can happen for all kinds of reasons. Typically in the event of a close margin of victory, following accusations of maybe election fraud, or due to the possibility of even administrative errors. They can occur automatically or be requested by candidate or voters at every level of government, from local offices all the way up to theoretically the presidential election. And when they do happen, recounts cause people to wonder, well, how do recounts work anyway? So before we break for Thanksgiving, let's welcome our staff writer, Joe Greedy, to have a quick conversation about recounts. Joe, what's up? Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Big week. We got a turkey to eat later on this week. But for now, let's gobble up some recounts. So what is a recount? How does it actually work?
Yeah, a recount is just what it sounds like and a little bit more. I think most voters out there can get a sense for what a recount is from the name. It is a recount of all votes cast in an election, but it's a little bit more also. It's a process by which election officials verify that all ballots that were cast and counted during the original canvass were valid ballots and were cast by eligible voters and conformed with a state's election laws. The process of verifying whether a ballot conformed to a state's laws typically applies more to absentee mail-in ballots or provisional ballots. It's less of an issue with ballots cast in person. But during a recount, election officials will recount literally every ballot that was cast in an election, and they will verify that all those ballots were cast conforming with the state's laws.
Yeah, not of doubt, does every state allow a recount, or do some states not even allow them, or the differentiating factors? And how does that all work?
Yeah, there's a lot we can get into there. I think top line, first thing to address is almost every state allows or provides for some sort of opportunity for recounts. There's just 2 states that don't provide for recounts in state election laws. Those are Mississippi and Tennessee. And then breaking down the other 48 states' laws a little bit more, many states provide for automatic recounts in certain circumstances. That usually has to do with a close margin of victory. And 27 states provide for that possibility. And then the other option is requested recounts, where a candidate, a campaign, or even a group of voters can submit an application and request a recount. Sort of like automatic recounts, there are thresholds or circumstances that an election results must sort of conform to, or a certain type of result. They usually allow for a recount, but depends on the state.
Yeah, so, let's say in some states, if you and I are running for office, you crush me 80-20, and I say, I want a recount. In some states, they might say, you're outside the threshold. You cannot ask for a recount.
Yeah.
In some states, they might say, well, if you pay for it, we'll recount them, right? I mean, is that actually the case? Are there some states where no matter what the threshold, as long as the candidate who requests it pays for it, will they do it?
I can't say specifically whether or not there's a state where no matter what the margin is, you might be able to request a recount, but certainly the possibility for a requested recount changes a lot from state to state. In some states, it's similar to an automatic recount where there's got to be a close margin of victory. There's got to be some sort of credible allegation of electoral fraud in the process of the election for a group or candidate to request a recount. And then, in other states, it's sort of much more permissive. Their margin of victories are much wider. And if a candidate wants to cover the cost, state might be inclined to allow them to do so. And that's another topic that we can get into, who covers costs on requested recounts. Usually for automatic recounts, the costs are going to be covered by the state or the jurisdiction doing the recount, something required in law. So those costs are covered. But then for requested recounts, sort of depends. In some instances, for a requested recount, it's the same as an automatic recount, where the state is going to cover the costs or conforms with the margins or the circumstances the state has outlined in law. So that cost is going to be covered. And then to your point about refunds, that's sort of the other option or the potential option. More typically in requested recounts, the burden of the cost falls on the requester unless that requested recount overturns or changes the outcome of election. And most states, but not all, provide for a refund if there is a change in an outcome.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Joe. Okay, so what are some of the most well-known recounts? Let's just kind of remind and touch on that for our listeners. What are the most well-known recounts that happened, say, over the last 10, 20 years?
So yeah, I think there's one recount from the last 20 years that really stands out. It's the last time that a recount overturned a statewide election result, and that was in 2000, the 2008 election for U.S. Senate in Minnesota. Al Franken was ultimately elected to that office after trailing by about 200 votes in the original canvass. And that sort of gets to the larger question of if the last time a sort of statewide election outcome was overturned was almost 20 years ago now, how often does it actually occur? And the answer is it does not happen that often. There's some research from Fair Vote, an organization that tracks electoral systems and some voting policies, that less than 1 in 2,000 elections from 2000 to 2023 that went to a recount were overturned. So that's like well below 1% of elections that go to recounts ultimately end up overturning the result.
Are there ever challenges or fights around recount thresholds? I could kind of imagine that might happen where, if a race is, let's say you're in a state where there's a mandatory recount requirement at 0.5 percentage margin and the vote threshold's right around that. You can imagine candidates kind of challenging it. Maybe in some respects, one wants to go to a recount, maybe
Yeah.
one doesn't.
Yeah.
Have there ever been situations like that come up or anything to that mind coming up?
Yeah, I don't have specific examples for you to bring up right now, but it is a topic that comes up every time a recount is triggered. Again, there's automatic thresholds where it's out of the candidate's hands. But what goes on during a recount as well, and we can sort of get into the 2008 example and some more recent examples too to illustrate this point, but really oftentimes campaigns are sort of jockeying over groups of ballots. And oftentimes those ballots that are in question or going to be in question in a recount might be the difference between allowing a recount or not allowing a recount, requiring a recount or not requiring a recount. So definitely there's frequently challenges and litigation related to which ballots should be sort of considered as part of a recount margin. And then once you're into the recount process as well, there's a lot of sort of back and forth about that.
So there's two recounts in 2024 that are probably most aptly coming to mind. So what are the two that sort of seem like they've been freshest this election cycle?
Yeah, I think the recount for the U.S. Senate election in Pennsylvania, probably the most noteworthy and has sort of been garnered the most headlines. And as of the time of this recording, that recount is actually now over. And then there is an ongoing recount, or actually has not even started yet as of the time of this recording, for a statewide ballot measure. That's ballot measure 2 in Alaska, which would repeal the state's use of ranked choice voting. It'll be interesting to see what happens in that recount. In the Pennsylvania recount, ultimately the Democratic candidate, current Senator Bob Casey, conceded, and that ended the recount there. Both those recounts were automatic recounts, just an interesting sort of detail there. Both were triggered automatically by close margins of victory. And yeah,
We'll have to ask Ryan to come back on the show and talk about whether there have been a historical statewide ballot measure recounts or
Yeah.
not. Because that does seem like that's a pretty rare thing, but it'd be very interesting to check our database on that. But
yeah, it would be.
okay, so you said something interesting, though, about the Casey McCormick race. So there's an automatic recount, but then what happens when he concedes? So does that mean the recount stops, or does the recount keep going because it's statutorily required by the margin and the threshold?
So a little bit of a gray area. So great question. Love getting into those areas where it's not totally clear. In the case of Pennsylvania, the recount stopped. In this instance, it was up to sort of the chief election official, the officer in charge of conducting the recount. In Pennsylvania, in this instance, that was a Democrat elected to the statewide position of Secretary of State. It was Al Schmidt in Pennsylvania. And when Senator Casey conceded the election results to Dave McCormick, Schmidt issued a proclamation that the recount was now ending. As far as I understand as well, that was partly based on an agreement between the two campaigns. There was sort of a mutual agreement when the concession happened that litigation related to the recount was going to be withdrawn. So I think it does depend on those circumstances, whether or not it's sort of an amicable concession and whether or not there's agreement between the candidates to sort of withdraw outstanding challenges.
I mean, I imagine, right? Practically speaking, if you're an election worker and you don't have to recount millions of votes, I imagine you'd rather not have to do that. None of us want to do.
Yeah, it's certainly
Yeah, good.
Yeah, it's certainly a real, it's a lot of work. There's a canvas that oftentimes takes upwards of a week or weeks in some states. And it's basically saying, let's do that all over again and double check. And there's good reason to do that a lot of the time. But yeah.
Yeah, you're kind of so there is certainly like if every other policy area, some differing views and perspectives on recounts. What are some of the typical arguments that we see in favor of and opposed to different recount rules and laws and sort of policies out there?
Yeah, I think recounts are sort of a tricky topic in a way. It's almost like any issue within the election space these days. But I think recounts can sort of get some people, some folks, they might confuse some people. Why is a recount necessary? Shouldn't votes be counted accurately the first time a canvass takes place? And I think the answer to that is yes, unequivocally. And I think election officials across the country would agree. But recounts are really there to provide an extra layer of security and make sure that initial canvass is accurate, that if there are any questions that arise during that initial canvass and counting of votes, that there is an opportunity for candidates and campaigns to sort of officially lodge those challenges. And it really is a step for transparency and security. So I think it's a bit of a paradoxical idea in a sense. It's like, why should there be recounts? Shouldn't we get this right the first time? And the answer is yes. But recounts are basically ensuring that the system is working correctly and that there's one more opportunity to make sure everything is above board and the results are accurate and correct.
There's it kind of reminds me with football games, and that ref goes into the replay booth.
Oh yeah.
Right. And they're looking at the replay. Well, a couple of things can happen there. First of all, it can create some confidence in the viewer that they're getting the call right.
Mm-hmm.
But the longer they're in the booth, right, then the fans start getting a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, who are they talking to?
What's going on? Yeah. Why does it take it so long to make that decision, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the whole point of that story is voter confidence, which is often emotionally based. And there is a significant number of layers of our electoral system that are just based on confidence in the voter. So get it right. That's kind of the idea, right? So recounts a very important part of our electoral system that's been around for a long time. And it's just part of the nature of election administration, stuff that goes on behind the scenes. But to your points from earlier, a lot of it is just statutorily baked into the system. It's not particularly arbitrary. It's just what the statutes say. So
yeah, I think you can get into as well when you get to that level. Like, it is interesting to argue about the different thresholds in different states too. Some states have sort of a margin of 0.5. That's a pretty common margin for an automatic recount. Other states have a margin of 0.25. So just tying in some of the examples we've talked about, the 2008 recount in Minnesota. Minnesota state law requires an automatic recount for statewide races with a margin of less than 0.25%, 0.25. The margin in the Pennsylvania race this year was 0.26. So if that had occurred in Minnesota, there wouldn't have been a recount.
You wouldn't have had a recount at all. Yeah. One of the many, very interesting parts of our electoral system that is run by the states. So, Joe, good to see you. Enjoy Thanksgiving. And I'll have you on soon. Talk about 2025 and what lies ahead.
Likewise, Jeff. Thank you.
For our listeners, you can learn more about our coverage at the link in our show notes. Taking a break for the holiday and hope you will return next week. Hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallett, and thanks for listening.